Hello there ladies and gentlemen, TX141 here, also known as Paul, bringing you another Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode, I shall be reviewing the Focke-Wulf 190 A4. Having already provided a brief historical overview as to the origins behind the Focke-Wulf 190 Anton series aircraft, let us delve into the history behind the A4 variant. Following on from the introduction of the A1 to combat service as of June 1941, a number of Luftwaffe pilots were quick to complain that the armament of the aircraft was just not enough. The four 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns, laid out in the fashion whereby two were mounted above the engine and two were mounted in the inboard of the wings, combined with a pair of 20mm MG-FF cannon mounted in the outer boards of the wings, was deemed insufficient in terms of burst mass. As a result, the A2 was conceived as the replacement to the A1 and to fix this problem, with the two 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns above the engine being retained. Meanwhile, those in the inboard of the wings were replaced with a pair of 20mm MG-151 Mausler cannon. The two outerboard 20mm cannons, the MG-FF type of course, were originally removed from the previous design. However, with the A2 rolling out into combat capable hands as of November 1941, many pilots once again complained that the burst mass was just not enough for the aircraft, and as a result they deemed that the 20mm MG-FF cannons needed to be retrofitted to bring the plane up to combat capable spec. And so once this was achieved, many classed the A2 as the true first definitive variant of the Focke-Wulf 190 Anton, due to the standardisation of the armament to two 7.92mm machine guns, two 20mm MG-151 cannon, and two 20mm MG-FF Oclaron cannons. Nonetheless, following on from the arrival of the A2, the emphasis switched from armament to performance of the engine, with the A2 fielding a BMW 801C engine, working very effectively at an altitude range of 5,000 to 7,500 metres, making the plane much better than its Western contemporary, the Spitfire Mark V. This was to be compiled upon with the arrival in spring 1942 of the BMW 801D2 radial engine, providing 1,440 horsepower, and additionally the same performance in a given altitude range as the C variant of the engine. This gave way to the Focke-Wulf 190 A3 variant as of the spring of 1942, allowing it to maintain its supremacy on the Western Front. Yet, it was very quickly found that the performance of the aircraft faded so long as the pilot went above or below the altitude range specified, and so the A4 variant was conceived in July of 1942 to rectify this, with the addition of a methanol water MW50 power boost system. It was a brief injection system, allowing the pilot to get a little bit more performance out of the aircraft below 5,000 metres, although it could not be abused for too long, as otherwise it would cause severe damage to the spark plugs of the engine. Nonetheless, this made the Focke-Wulf 190 A series a much more effective fighter, especially on the Eastern Front where the dogfights were down at lower altitudes. And so, the Focke-Wulf 190 A4 was to remain in combat service until the arrival of the A5 in April 1943, seeing a number of Jarbo variants, i.e. fighter bomber variants, thanks to the addition of the kits, or the conversion kits known as Umrüstbausätze, and these kits were to form the basis of those employed on the A5 variant. Nonetheless, with that being said, let us see how the Focke-Wulf 190 A4 handles in War Thunder. Hence, today's gameplay is taken from the ground strike map Alpine Meadows to the following setup. Omni-Purpose rounds for the 7.92mm machine gun, the reason being that this belt consists of a good portion of armour-piercing and tracer rounds, and these have two purposes. The armour-piercing rounds allow us to puncture enemy fuel tanks, and the tracer component acts as a means of us range-finding our targets at roughly 500 to 700 metres. If I begin to see my machine guns impact at these ranges, this means that I've got a good chance when I get closer to my target of bringing the 20mm cannons into play and hitting my target effectively. We then compile this with air target belts for both the 20mm MG-151 and MG-FF-M cannons. The reason being that in both cases, the air target belts consist of a large portion of high explosive, if not high explosive incendiary, mine and Geschoss rounds, having a devastating impact on fuselages and key components of enemy aircraft, whether they be fighter or bomber alike. Compile this with the fragmentation incendiary tracer rounds of the MG-FFs in particular, and you have the armament which is able to rip apart components of an aircraft and the fragmentation rounds have a very good chance of killing pilots and gunners alike. What is more, we are using a 300 meter gun convergence, the reason being that the cannons, due to their layout of inboard and outerboard positioning in the wings, have a very large spread, and I want to implement this as much as possible at extended ranges when going up against larger wingspan targets such as enemy bombers, of which we have two to play with very shortly, a Year 2 M105 and a Wellington Mark 10. Yet, when we are not engaging larger targets, I like to make my kills at close range, swooping in on my foes and bringing my cannons to bear only at roughly 400 to 300 metres, if not less. And this means I will need a tight convergence to be accurate on smaller wingspan targets. Finally, we are using the standardised 30-minute fuel load as we come in close on a Year 2 M105, and within the first 100 rounds of our cannon ammunition, we set them on fire and cripple them to the point whereby the crew are going to have to bail out shortly. We then draw our attention towards an enemy Wellington Mark 10. And with our first kill already in the bag, we can see that we opened fire at 600 metres, and by 300 metres the damage had been done. We are going to rinse and repeat this here with the Wellington Mark 10. Coming in from behind, but at an angle whereby only the side gunner can get a shot on us for the time being, we can see that we only needed roughly 50 rounds there in order to get a Hercules medal. And so with 2 kills in the bag and coming around, we see a friendly Wellington being pursued by an enemy P-51D Mustang, who has tunnel visioned quite severely. As a result, we use our WEP to build up our speed a little bit and engage at 500 metres, achieving the kill at exactly 300 metres. We then see an enemy Messerschmitt 109 G6 heading towards the Wellington, but already their attention has been drawn to us quite quickly, and so we go into a head-on. I spray indiscriminately here and snap roll thanks to my very high roll rate and decent elevator response to dodge all the incoming fire, yet at the same time the G6 does so as well. We then have a G2 come up towards us, and I fire a quick burst, absorbing a very light spray of 7.92mm machine gun fire to my right wing, and with the oil tank of the G2 punctured, I proceed on my way, rather than turning around and going up against difficult odds. This allows us to converge on a Illusion 4 bomber, and we achieve our 4th kill at a very similar vein as with the other bomber kills, opening fire at roughly 450 metres and achieving the kill by 300 metres, ripping off the wing I believe. We then go for a reload and continue our relentless onslaught by seeing an enemy B-17 and a Heinkel 111H. Now whilst we have a short period, I want to point out the reason why I'm not using the stealth belts for the cannons, as those contain a very similar constitution to the air target belts. Now the reason for this is because I want to be as intimidating as possible for a battle rating 4.3 plane which has one of the highest burst masses all the way up to tier 4. When I go head to head with opponents such as those Messerschmitt 109G series aircraft and I begin to spray at roughly 1.1 to 1.0 kilometers, I want my opponents not to think, well, he's only firing with the machine guns and he'll bring the cannons to bear at a closer range, but instead, my goodness, that's a lot of ammunition coming towards me, I better get out of the way. And on a number of occasions this has forced a lot of opponents that I've gone up against to actually bail out of the head-on at roughly 900 metres, meaning that I can either fly past and continue on my way, or I can break onto my opponent and knock them out of the game. And that is the difference between the air target belts in my opinion, with their limited tracer component, and the purely stealth belts. And as I say that, we come up underneath a B-17 Flying Fortress, with the first burst from one of their underside gunners taking out our oil tank. We managed to achieve a fire and kill at least one of the gunners. And at this point I'm going to show the durability of the Focke-Wulf 190 A-4 to its extreme, as many planes would at this point bail out of chasing a B-17 down due to all the turrets on the aircraft, but not in this plane with its significant amount of armour plating around the cockpit and also the decent armoured glass. I drop my altitude a little bit in order to build up my speed, and then I use my significant climb rate within the altitude range this plane was destined for historically to allow me to come up underneath the B-17 and continue my onslaught. I kill another gunner, yet I still have at least one rear turret with two 12.7mm Browning 50 cals firing at me. Yet, my third burst allows me to rip off the left hand wing and achieve another kill. When an ace in a day now in the bag and my engine's temperature rising quite rapidly, I notice an enemy Messerschmitt 109 up high at roughly 6,000 metres. And whilst this plane performs well at 6,000 metres altitude, and this extends up to 7,500, much like the historical counterpart, I am not going to play against a Messerschmitt at its own game, high altitude performance. And with my plane in an increasingly poor state, I decide to bail out and dive down onto an enemy Beaufighter. It was being pursued by a friendly Yak-3, and so I had to bail out of my potential boom and zoom pass. Yet I put the distance between myself and the enemy Messerschmitt, and that is all I needed to do so I could switch off my engine and begin to drop my engine temperature and stop my oil temperature from rising as rapidly as it may have. At this point I bank around once again, and whilst the turn circle of the Focke-Wulf 190 A4 is not going to win you many turn fights, you can see with increasing speed the turn circle is actually quite decent. Indeed, the turn circle is comparable to say an A-4 FN in some respects, although this is only achieved with increasing speed. And so I would personally recommend keeping this plane at a speed of roughly 400 to 500 km an hour if you intend to make any sharp turns, and this is a good threshold for overall performance in general. This does extend down to roughly 325 km an hour, but only in the case of boom and zoom runs. In a similar vein, by going above 675 km an hour, you will begin to experience a brief roll rate lockup, and this is exacerbated at roughly 750 km an hour, although not to the point whereby boom and zoom tactics are ineffectual. Indeed, the roll rate stays with you enough to replicate that of say a Yakovlev Yak-3, even at 850 km an hour. It is at this point that I am trying to essentially land, although I see a PBJ and a Focke-Wulf 190 at roughly 3 km distance, and I have a very good feeling that as soon as my landing gear touches the ground, these two planes will be on my back, like a bad rash. And so, with the Focke-Wulf 190A being knocked out and the PBJ on its last legs by the looks of things, I decide to cut my engine once again, drop my altitude and begin my approach for landing. Although as we are going to see over the course of this game, that is a rather difficult proposition to fulfill. Continuing on with our discussion of this aircraft then, I said that against the B-17G the durability is reasonable. Indeed, this plane is able to soak up a good portion of fire, so long as the fire is directed towards the main fuselage. The wings are sturdy, although be aware a couple of 20mm high explosive rounds have got a good chance of ripping a wing off. We break up underneath this B-17 here, and we quickly dispatch their right hand wing for our 6th kill. We can see just how effective the overall spray of the ammunition, the cannon ammunition that is, at extended distances with a tight convergence, and on occasion I will even use a 200 m gun convergence to extend this overall spread of ammunition even further. Although really, I fly at 300 m gun convergence for the reasons being that this is the range I usually engage targets when trying to dive on them in the midst of say a furball, or indeed when chasing down my foes. At this point I am trying to stay out of the way of the attentions of the two Messerschmitt 109s, one at the same altitude as myself, being 3,150 metres, and one well up at approximately 5,000 to 6,000 metres altitude. Reason being, if I get one of those on my tail, the only way I'm going to beat it is by using my high roll rate to change direction continually. I see an enemy Ki-10 down in the valley, yet that is insignificant as a target, seen as the F4U Corsair is pulling distance and may eventually just loop round and engage in a head-on. I see a proportion of enemy fighters and friendly fighters creating what is a small recognition of a furball towards our friendly spawn. And so as I level out and continue building up my speed and altitude at 3,500 metres, as soon as my speed hits 430 km an hour, I decide to dive down this P-63 King Cobra and enemy LA-5, and we are going to see the Focke-Wulf 190 A4 in its best element, boom and zoom. Building up my speed, I'm holding my fire, and at 0.45 km I open fire on this King Cobra. My accuracy is a little bit off here, but I eventually make my shots count at dead on 300 metres. And the same with the LA-5 FN, although here we're at 200 metres, and very quickly we achieve the critical hit followed by the kill, making it a score of 8 so far. We then note behind us that whilst we are at a speed of roughly 660 km an hour, we have a P-51D Mustang, which is just as fast in a dive if not faster, and so we are going to have to enter an engagement. And this is how you deal with a foe who gets onto your tail and can turn with you if not outturn you. Use the terrain to your advantage if you have it, prevent the opponent from getting a clean shot on you, and then use your roll rate to its greatest possible effect. You're going to see here that whilst the Mustang does stay behind me before overshooting, I'm able to use my roll rate in order to completely change direction and put myself onto target. We take out the elevator of the Mustang, and as I continually spray ammunition after them, I eventually achieve my 9th kill. I must apologise for exaggerating the overall nature of the Mustang's performance there, yet I believe very shortly I'm going to have another dogfight with an LA-7, which is going to show this plane in an even greater aspect. Once again, the LA-7B is a plane which can technically perform with me, and so I turn tightly towards the ground, and I continually change my direction as we go into an upward climb. The reason being the LA-7B's got just as high roll rate as me technically, yet I'm able to use my decent roll rate to change my direction enough to prevent the LA-7 from getting a clean shot, allow me to stall them out and my teammates to get the kill. I then converge onto the side or the beam shot of an A6M2 for my double ace. Whilst I was firing a little bit indiscriminately into the midst of friendly fighters, we made our shots count, and due to the close range, the spread of our cannon ammunition was not too significant to allow us to hit our friendlies. And it's at this point, as you can see, my oil temperature and my engine temperature are now amber and heading towards the red zone, and I see an enemy LA-5 hanging around the airfield. At this point, as my engine and my oil temperature turn red, I do not want to engage the attentions of the LA-5, but at the same time I do not want to stray too far from the airfield in case my engine suddenly dies on me. And interestingly enough, on a historical note, the BMW 801 engine did have some reliability issues, occasionally actually just switching off permanently in the midst of a flight, although I do not know enough about this to go any further. The LA-5 continues to harass the AA guns on the airfield. It is an LA-5 F, and I decide to proceed over and try to engage the LA-5 in a head-on, continuing looking up and around me to make sure I've not got any enemy planes trying to dive down on me, as I am potentially a sitting duck at an altitude of 1,730 metres. I open fire briefly, realising the LA-5F is not interested in the head-on. Indeed, their attentions are focused, it would seem, on attacking the AA guns. I knock out the elevator with a limited portion of my MG-FF cannon, and then I use the remnant ammunition of my MG-151s to get the kill, making it a score of 11. I see an enemy Yak-9 here, and I spray a small burst in, achieving a hit, although I know the Yak-9 would get away from me and I would only move further away from the airfield as my engine goes ever more red on the indicator. I see a Junkers 87 being harassed by a group of friendly fighters here, and an enemy Messerschmitt 109 flying away. My time has almost come to land now as I reload all my guns for one last ditch effort if required. Yet, I soon decide to bite the bullet and think to myself, well, if they're going to knock me out on the airfield, they're going to do so. There's nothing I can do about it anymore. We seem to have a clear period to land, and so we are going to do so. And one of the lovely things about this aircraft is the ease with which you can land. The undercarriage is very nicely positioned, and due to its overall width, you've got the ability to land at high speed rather effectively. As we're going to see here, whilst I do almost overshoot the runway slightly as I come in a little bit too hot, it is very easy to land this aircraft by comparison with, say, a Messerschmitt 109, due to the tightness of the undercarriage, or even say that of a Spitfire. Nonetheless, when we discuss the performance of this aircraft, we have so far pointed out that its performance lies within, say, a speed range of 400 to 500 km an hour. That is where I find it performs best. Additionally, we seem to have hinted at the fact that this plane leans away from turn fighting and prefers boom and zoom style fighting or a more energy based aspect. We compile this by realising that the overall altitude performance of this aircraft is not limited to low altitudes. As I pointed out earlier, at roughly 6,000 metres altitude, this plane flies rather nicely, although by comparison with, say, a Messerschmitt 109 Gustav or indeed the Friedrich versions, you will not have the overall high altitude performance that those planes are designed for. Instead, I prefer to fly this plane in a rough altitude range of 3,000 to 5,500 metres. The reason being, at 5,500 metres, this is usually the highest altitude you will see a good portion of the enemy bombers at, meaning that you are able to intercept the enemy bombers before they can proceed any higher following their spawn altitude of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 metres. At the same time, the majority of the enemy fighters in a given game, especially ground strike, will usually occupy altitudes only up to 4,000 metres, and so you can provide an altitude ceiling cap, and that at the same time have the ability to engage the more medium to high altitude fighter types such as the LA-5 or the LA-7 when and where appropriate. However, never be afraid to rush down to lower altitudes. At 1,500 metres altitude, the performance of this aircraft is maintained, although do be aware your top speed will drop, of course due to standardised air resistance, and also the engine will lose a little bit of its performance for arcade mode. Much like its historical counterpart, you do have the ability to use that methanol water 50 injection to build your speed up to some extent, yet at the same time you're always going to find that this plane strives to be just a little bit higher in altitude by comparison with the lower altitudes of some of your opponents. And as a result, this means that the plane can be caught out if you continue to fly it at below 2,000 metres, as some of your opponents, especially in your Kovlev Yak series planes such as the Yak-3 and the Yak-1, will be able to eventually catch up with you and outperform you with decreasing altitude. Nonetheless, nobody is going to match up to your burst mass, and so if you ever feel threatened, I always find turning for a head-on can be just as useful, with that higher roll rate and indeed the elevator response enabling you to tackle your opponents without fear, as when your armament does not hit the target and knock them out, you've always got the ability to snap roll out the way. Yet, in the course of snap rolls I have not mentioned the concept of the rudder, and that is the interesting part of the A-4. I find the rudder is alright, although its overall responsiveness is rather restricted by comparison with that of the Messerschmitt 109 F4, indeed the battle rated 4.0 or 4.3 counterpart if you are flying the Trop version. The rudder is good for making very quick adjustments on the fly, yet I would not depend on the rudder for manoeuvres such as hammerheads. Reason being, the rudder is sometimes a little bit sluggish by comparison with that of your counterparts, and it can leave you in a bit of a sticky situation whilst you're being pursued. I put the majority of the emphasis of my manoeuvres on the overall roll rate and the elevator response. Yet this Dornier 217E2 knocking out our base, it is time to review the stat screens. Hence, we can see that our 11 kills enabled us to obtain 39,381 silver lines. On top of this we had 1,653 research points, with 496 going towards our work on the Heinkel 162A2. We hereby conclude our review of the Focke-Wulf 190A4 by realising that this aircraft is an absolutely devastating energy fighter for its battle rating of 4.3 and tier of 2. If you can implement the decent climb rate of this plane to get you to the optimum altitude range of 3,000 to 5,500 meters altitude, you will thereby have a very good acceleration and high top speed to enable you to chase down any foe, fighter or bomber alike, with ease. Upon chasing down these foes and getting them into your gun sight, you only have to squeeze the trigger for a 1 to 2 second burst, usually to do the damage, thanks to your very high burst mass. Additionally, if you find yourself up against a foe who is able to outperform you with increasing altitude, such as the P-51D Mustang or the Messerschmitt 109 Gustav II, you can always goad your opponent into a head-on, whereby you can use your high roll rate and decent elevator response to snap roll tightly and dodge the brunt of the incoming fire while dishing out your own damage. And after a single head-on, most of your opponents will not want to come back for another dose. At the same time, if they do turn to face you, you have the ability to extend with ease, and, if needs be, go into a rather steep dive and maintain your roll rate up to a speed of 675 km an hour, whereby it begins to depreciate and become comparable to that of a Yak-3 at 800 km an hour. Nonetheless, this plane does have some weaknesses, as despite its high durability, the performance of this aircraft begins to drop away with decreasing altitude, especially below 3,000 meters, and we displayed that as we came first by comparison to the rest of our team by a significant margin. Whilst the opening portion of the game was spent up at higher altitudes, pursuing enemy bombers and harassing the enemy high altitude fighters where possible, the latter portion was spent dodging incoming fire down at lower altitudes, with the P-51D5 Mustang chasing us down below 3,000 meters and overshooting thanks to our usage of our high roll rate and some terrain in order to make sure our opponent overshot and put themselves right in front of our guns. By changing direction continually, you are able to make your opponent have difficulty to get the shot on you, and we found that especially in the case of the LA-7B, whereby by the time they'd managed to start to get their shot onto target, a friendly fighter had already dispatched them. Nonetheless, when engaging more versatile or turn fighter based foes such as the Yakovlev Yak-3, the Spitfire F Mark 9 or the A6M3 Razor, you will find that at lower altitudes, especially below 1,500 meters altitude, your performance in terms of top speed and acceleration will become comparable to these opponents rather than better them, and as a result, upon changing direction a number of times, you may find your speed will drop below 300 km an hour and you will be a sitting duck in the sky for your opponents to bear the brunt of their firepower onto you. At the same time, due to your extended turn circle and sluggish rudder response, you will not be able to turn fight with your opponents effectively, and so I would advise very strongly not allowing yourself to be enticed into fights down at extremely low altitudes, seeing as your plane's performance will drop to the point whereby you become comparable with your opponents rather than superior to. Indeed, if you can avoid this pitfall, you will find that the Focke-Wulf 190A4 fears no man in the sky, and it may just be the fighter for you. And so I've been TX141, And if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. Yet until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.